March 1918, the Somme sector. Dawn has not yet broken, but the German barrage has just lifted. Steam rises from fresh craters. The air stinks of cordite and torn earth. Through the smoke comes a different sound. It is not the crack of rifle fire. It is not the slow thudding of a machine gun. It is something faster, harsher, mechanical. A stuttering roar. 30 rounds in 3 seconds. A German assault soldier moves through a communication trench. His uniform is field grey, his face mud-streaked. On his back he carries a light assault pack, storm equipment stripped of everything unnecessary. Stick grenades hang from his belt. At chest level he carries a weapon unlike any rifle. It has no long barrel, no wooden stock extending past the grip. In his hands is a short, angular metal tube fed by a drum magazine bolted to the left side. The MP-18 Maschinenpistole. The weapon weighs 4 kilograms without the magazine. With the 32-round trommel magazine drum attached, it approaches 5 kilograms. Not heavy by machine gun standards, heavy enough to feel substantial. The wooden stock presses against his shoulder. His right hand grips the pistol grip. His left hand supports the barrel shroud. He has trained with this weapon for 3 weeks. He knows its rate of fire, its effective range, its tendency to climb if not controlled. He knows that the drum empties in 4 seconds of continuous fire. He knows not to let that happen. He reaches a trench traverse. The earthwork angles sharply to the left. Standard construction designed to limit blast effects and fields of fire. British soldiers are sheltering there, deafened by the barrage, disoriented. Some are still in the dugout entrance. Others are emerging, rifles in hand, trying to form a defense. They have been shelled for 5 hours. They cannot hear clearly, they cannot think clearly, and they are too slow. The stormtrooper does not aim carefully. He does not fire single shots. He levels the weapon at chest height and pulls the trigger. The MP-18 fires continuously. The bolt slams back and forth inside the receiver. Empty brass cases fountain from the ejection port, tumbling through the air, bouncing off earthen walls. 9mm parabellum rounds tear through the confined space at 300 meters per second. Each round weighs 8 grams. Each carries 500 joules of energy. At 15 meters, they punch through wool uniforms, web gear, and flesh without slowing. The effect is instant and overwhelming. At ranges under 20 meters, automatic pistol caliber fire is devastating. There is no time to work a bolt, no time to aim, no time to return fire. The burst lasts 3 seconds. 8 rounds fired. The traverse falls silent. The stormtrooper releases the trigger. He checks the corners, the dugout entrance, the fire step. Nothing moves. Smoke hangs in the air. The smell of burnt powder mixes with the smell of blood. He moves forward, weapon ready. Behind him, 2 more assault troops enter the trench. One carries an MP-18. The other carries stick grenades and an entrenching tool. They do not stop to check the bodies. They push forward. Speed is survival. This is not a frontal assault across no man's land. This is infiltration. This is close quarters, fighting in earthworks and dugouts. This is where the war has become most savage. This is where men fight with grenades, clubs, and knives. This is where rifle length is a liability and rifle range is irrelevant. And this is where the MP-18 was designed to kill. 50 meters forward, the communication trench intersects with a fire trench running parallel to no man's land. British soldiers are firing at targets to the north, unaware that Germans have penetrated behind them. The stormtrooper with the MP-18 reaches the intersection. He does not announce himself. He steps into the fire trench, turns right, and fires a burst down the trench line. 5 British soldiers fall. The survivors turn. 2 raise rifles. Neither fires. A second burst cuts them down. The entire engagement lasts 6 seconds. This was not a rifle. It was not a machine gun. It was something entirely new, and it arrived exactly where the war had become most brutal. The crisis in the trenches. By 1917, the Western Front had congealed into the most lethal stalemate in military history. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, 2 million men faced each other across a maze of trenches, barbed wire, and shell-pocked ground. The weapons they carried had been designed for open warfare. The reality they faced was nothing like it. The standard infantry rifle was the bolt-action repeater. The German Gewehr 98, the British Lee Enfield, the French Liebel. All were accurate to 600 meters. All required manual operation between shots. All were utterly wrong for fighting at arm's length in a trench. The Gewehr 98 was 1,250 millimeters long, over 4 feet. With bayonet fixed, it exceeded 1,700 millimeters. In a trench 5 feet wide, turning such a weapon was difficult. Thrusting a bayonet required room to lunge. Most trench traverses were too narrow, most dugout entrances were too low. Soldiers entering these spaces had to hold their rifles at awkward angles, muzzle up or across the body. This was tactically suicidal. The first man into a confined space needed to be able to fire immediately from any position without careful aim. A bolt-action rifle could not do this. When soldiers met in dugouts or communication trenches, rifle length became a liability. A long barrel snagged on earthworks, on wooden supports, on barbed wire coils that hung from trench walls. A bayonet was useful only if you had room to thrust. Most close-quarters fighting ended with grenades, entrenching tools, clubs, or pistols. None of these provided sustained firepower. The pistol was portable, it could be drawn quickly. Officers and NCOs carried them as a matter of course, but effective range rarely exceeded 15 meters, and magazine capacity was 7 to 10 rounds. The Luger P-08 held 8 rounds. The British Webley held 6. Against multiple defenders or in poor visibility, a pistol left the attacker vulnerable after the first shots. Reloading under fire was slow. Dropping an empty magazine, retrieving a fresh one from a pouch, inserting it, and chambering a round took precious seconds. Seconds that meant death in close combat. In a narrow trench, a machine gun could not traverse quickly. The bipod had to be planted. The gun had to be aimed. It could not be swung from target to target without lifting the entire weapon. Muzzle blast in a confined space was deafening and disorienting, affecting the gunner as much as the enemy. The weight meant that machine gunners moved slowly, burdened by the weapon, the ammunition, the spare parts. In a fast-moving assault through trench systems, machine guns arrived too late. The fighting was over before they could be deployed effectively. What was needed was automatic fire in a package smaller than a rifle, firing a cartridge light enough to control in rapid fire, with enough ammunition capacity to clear a trench section without reloading. The weapon needed to be shoulder-fired for accuracy and control. It needed to be robust enough to function in mud, water, and freezing conditions. It needed to be simple enough to manufacture in wartime when machining capacity was stretched and skilled labor was scarce. And it needed to fire a cartridge already in production to avoid straining logistical systems that were already near collapse. No such weapon existed in 1914. By 1918, Germany had built one. Germany faced a problem its enemies did not fully share. By 1917, the British Empire could draw on manpower reserves from India, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, and eventually the United States. France had colonial troops from North and West Africa, men who could be thrown into the grinder to replace French losses. Russia, before its collapse, had mobilized millions of peasant conscripts. Even after the Bolshevik Revolution removed Russia from the war, the arrival of American forces compensated for the loss. Germany had its own population and little else. Austria-Hungary was collapsing, its subject peoples increasingly unwilling to fight. The Ottoman Empire was being driven back in the Middle East and the Caucasus. Bulgaria was exhausted. German casualty rates on the Western Front had been catastrophic. At Verdun in 1916, Germany lost approximately 337,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The Somme cost another 500,000. Passchendaele and the fighting in Flanders in 1917 added hundreds of thousands more. Every defensive battle, every counterattack, every raid eroded trained infantry. The men lost were not easily replaced. Replacements arriving at the front in 1917 were younger, less experienced, more poorly trained than the pre-war regulars and reservists lost in 1914 and 1915. Physical standards had been lowered. Training periods had been shortened. The quality of German infantry was declining. The German army in 1918 could not replace losses with equivalent manpower. It had to find another way. The answer was tactical innovation. If Germany could not match Allied numbers, it would develop new methods of attack that required fewer men to achieve the same results. This thinking produced the Stoßtruppen, the assault or storm troops, small units of specially trained soldiers equipped with grenades, flamethrowers, light machine guns, and other weapons designed for infiltration and shock action. The Stoßtruppen concept had emerged from experience on the Eastern Front and in the battles around Verdun. Captain Willy Rohr had formed the first experimental detachment in 1915, testing new tactics and equipment. By 1917, stormtroop training was standardized. Selected infantry were pulled from frontline units, sent to training schools behind the lines, and drilled in infiltration tactics. They learned to move in small groups, to bypass strong points rather than attack them frontally, to penetrate deep into enemy positions and sow confusion. They were given the best available equipment. They were fed better rations. They were treated as elite formations, and they were expected to lead every major assault. The Stoßtruppen did not attack on a broad front. They probed for weak points, found gaps in the enemy line, exploited them ruthlessly. They penetrated deep, targeting command posts, artillery positions, supply dumps. They left follow-on forces to mop up resistance they bypassed. This was not the methodical bite-and-hold tactics of earlier offensives. This was rapid, violent penetration. It relied on speed, surprise, and overwhelming local firepower. They needed weapons that could kill quickly in close quarters. They needed a weapon that could clear a trench in seconds, suppress defenders long enough for grenades to be thrown, maintain fire while moving through confined spaces. This was the environment that demanded the MP-18. The MP-18 was the work of Hugo Schmeisser, a firearms designer working for Theodor Bergmann Waffenfabrik in Suhl, Germany. Schmeisser was born in 1884, the son of Louis Schmeisser, himself a noted firearms designer. Hugo grew up in the trade, learning machining and design from childhood. By 1914, he was working for Bergmann, a company that had produced pistols and machine guns since the 1890s. Schmeisser was not a household name in 1918, but his work would define submachine gun development for the next 3 decades. The German military had approached Bergmann in 1916 with a requirement for a new weapon. The specification was clear. The weapon had to fire automatically. It had to be light enough for one man to carry and operate for extended periods. It had to use a pistol cartridge, both to reduce recoil and to simplify ammunition logistics, since pistol rounds were already in mass production for the P-08 Luger and other service pistols. It had to be reliable under trench conditions, meaning it had to function when covered in mud, soaked in water, or exposed to freezing temperatures, and it had to be simple enough to manufacture in wartime, when precision machining was a luxury and production capacity was stretched to breaking point. Schmeisser understood the requirements. He had studied the Italian Villar Perosa, a double-barreled automatic weapon firing 9mm Glisenti ammunition. The Villar Perosa was mechanically interesting, but tactically useless as an infantry weapon. It was mounted on a bipod or artillery shield. It could not be shoulder-fired. It was a crew-served weapon, not a personal arm. Schmeisser needed something different. He needed a weapon that one man could carry, aim, and fire without assistance. The cartridge choice was straightforward. The German army had already adopted the 9x19mm parabellum round for the P-08 Luger pistol. This cartridge, developed by Georg Luger and introduced in 1902, generated manageable recoil, was lethal at the ranges that mattered in trench fighting, and was already being produced in enormous quantities. Annual production of 9mm parabellum ammunition exceeded 200 million rounds by 1917. Using this cartridge meant the new weapon would not strain supply chains or require the development of new ammunition factories. The 9x19mm parabellum round consisted of a 124-grain full metal jacket bullet driven to approximately 350 meters per second from a pistol barrel. Energy at the muzzle was roughly 500 joules. This was far less than a rifle cartridge, which generated 3,500 joules or more. But at ranges under 50 meters, terminal ballistics were adequate. The round would penetrate wool uniforms, leather equipment, and flesh. It would not penetrate steel helmets or thick wooden planks, but in trench fighting, these were rarely the targets. The target was an unarmored human body at close range. For this, 9mm parabellum was sufficient. Schmeisser's design employed simple blowback operation. This was the most mechanically straightforward method of automatic fire. When a round was fired, the expanding gases drove the bullet forward down the barrel and simultaneously pushed the cartridge case backward. The case pressed against the bolt face. The bolt was not locked to the barrel. It was simply a heavy mass held in place by a recoil spring. The pressure of the expanding gases pushed the bolt rearward, but the bolt's inertia and the resistance of the recoil spring delayed this movement long enough for the bullet to exit the barrel and for chamber pressure to drop to safe levels. The bolt then continued rearward, extracting and ejecting the spent case. At the rear of its travel, the bolt compressed the recoil spring fully. The spring then drove the bolt forward again, stripping a fresh round from the magazine, chambering it and firing it as the bolt's fixed firing pin struck the primer. As long as the trigger was held down, the cycle repeated. This was mechanically simple. There were no gas pistons, no rotating bolts, no complex locking lugs or camming surfaces. The bolt moved in a straight line. The recoil spring was a simple coil. The extractor was a small claw that gripped the cartridge rim. The ejector was a fixed blade that caught the cartridge case as the bolt moved rearward. Fewer parts meant less to break, less to manufacture, less to maintain. This was essential for a wartime weapon. The MP-18 fired from an open bolt. This meant that when the weapon was ready to fire, the bolt was held to the rear, compressing the recoil spring. Pulling the trigger released the bolt, which moved forward under spring pressure, chambered around from the magazine, and fired it as the bolt reached full forward position. This design had several advantages. It simplified the trigger mechanism. It allowed heat to dissipate from the chamber between bursts. It reduced the risk of cook-offs, where a hot chamber ignited a round without the trigger being pulled. The disadvantage was that accuracy was slightly reduced, since the mass of the bolt moving forward created momentum that shifted the point of aim. For a weapon intended for close quarters fighting, this was acceptable. The barrel was 196 millimeters long, just under 8 inches. This was long enough to allow complete powder combustion, but short enough to keep overall length manageable. Total length of the weapon was 813 millimeters with the stock extended. Weight without magazine was 4.2 kilograms. With a loaded 32-round drum, the weapon weighed approximately 5.2 kilograms. This was heavier than a rifle, but not unmanageably so. A soldier could carry the weapon for hours without excessive fatigue. Rate of fire was approximately 400 to 450 rounds per minute, roughly 7 rounds per second. This was slower than most machine guns, which fired at 600 rounds per minute or more. The slower rate was deliberate. It improved controllability and reduced ammunition consumption. A burst of 3 rounds took less than half a second. This was fast enough to hit a moving target, slow enough to allow the shooter to release the trigger before expending the entire magazine. The stock was wooden, fixed in place. It could not be folded or removed. This made the weapon more stable and reduced complexity. The pistol grip was wooden, angled at 45 degrees. The barrel was surrounded by a perforated steel shroud that allowed air cooling while protecting the shooter's hand from the hot barrel. The sights were simple, a front post and a rear notch, fixed and non-adjustable. Effective range was estimated at 50 meters for aimed fire, though the weapon could hit targets at greater distances with luck. The magazine was the weakest part of the design. Schmeisser used the Trommel Magazine 08, a 32-round snail drum originally developed for the P-08 Luger artillery model, a long-barreled variant used by machine gun crews and artillery observers. The drum was a complex mechanism. Cartridges were stored in a spiral arrangement inside the drum housing. A spring-driven follower pushed rounds toward the feed tower. The drum attached to the left side of the weapon's receiver, feeding through a curved channel into the chamber. This was mechanically clever, but practically problematic. The drum was bulky, adding width to the weapon and making it awkward to carry in confined spaces. It was heavy, weighing 340 grams empty, over 700 grams when loaded. It was difficult to reload under fire. Loading the drum required inserting each round individually, compressing the spring with each addition. An experienced soldier could load a drum in 2 minutes. Under fire in darkness, with cold or wounded hands, it took longer. The drum was prone to spring failures if left loaded for extended periods. Soldiers learned not to trust drums that had been preloaded for more than a few days. The spring tension weakened and feeding became erratic. Dirt, mud, or debris in the drum's mechanism caused immediate stoppages. The drum had to be kept clean, an impossibility in trench warfare. Despite these flaws, the MP-18 solved every other problem. It was portable, it was automatic, it was controllable in rapid fire, it used ammunition already in production, it could be manufactured with existing tooling and production methods, and it could clear a trench faster than any weapon then in service. The MP-18 entered production in early 1918. Bergmann's factory in Suhl was the primary manufacturer, but subcontractors were brought in to meet demand. Haenel, another Suhl-based firearms company, produced components and complete weapons. By November 1918, approximately 35,000 units had been manufactured. This was not mass production by later standards, but it was a substantial achievement for a weapon introduced in the final year of the war. Production was limited by several factors. The weapon was not as simple to manufacture as it appeared. The receiver required precision machining to ensure the bolt ran smoothly. The barrel had to be manufactured to tight tolerances. The drum magazine required specialized tooling and skilled assembly. Germany's industrial capacity in 1918 was strained. Raw materials were scarce. Skilled workers had been conscripted into the army. Factories were running at reduced capacity due to labor shortages and Allied blockade effects. Producing 35,000 MP-18s meant diverting resources from other weapons production. Every MP-18 manufactured meant fewer rifles, fewer machine guns, fewer artillery pieces produced. The weapon was not issued broadly. It did not replace the rifle. It did not go to every infantryman. The MP-18 was a specialist weapon, assigned to men trained in its use and employed in specific tactical roles. This was deliberate. Ammunition consumption was high, and logistical capacity was already strained. Issuing MP-18 to entire battalions would have been impossible. The German army could not have supplied enough 9mm ammunition to feed tens of thousands of MP-18s in sustained combat. Typical allocation was 1 or 2 MP-18s per assault squad, which numbered 8 to 12 men. Larger raiding parties might carry 6 to 8. An assault company of 150 men might have 20 MP-18s distributed among its squads. This was enough to provide automatic firepower at the point of contact without overwhelming the supply system. The men who received them were not chosen at random. They were experienced soldiers, often veterans of previous trench raids, men who understood urban and confined space fighting. Physical fitness was important. The weapon and ammunition added weight to an already heavy combat load. Stormtroopers carried grenades, entrenching tools, gas masks, water, rations, and spare drum magazines. Total load could exceed 25 kilograms. Training was essential. The MP-18 was not intuitive to operate for soldiers accustomed to bolt-action rifles. The weapon had to be carried with the bolt forward, safe when not in immediate use. To fire, the soldier pulled the bolt handle to the rear, locking it in the open position. Pulling the trigger released the bolt, which moved forward and fired. This was different from rifle operation. Soldiers had to train until the motions became automatic. They trained with the weapon until they could reload the drum magazine in darkness, clear stoppages by feel, and fire controlled bursts without overshooting. They learned that the weapon climbed in sustained fire, the muzzle rising as the bolt cycled. They learned to compensate by holding the weapon firmly and firing in short bursts. They learned that the open bolt design meant the weapon could be jammed by debris entering the chamber. They learned to keep the weapon covered when not firing, to protect the action from mud and dirt. The MP-18 was most commonly seen in the hands of Stoßtruppen and Sturmtruppen units, the elite assault troops who spearheaded German offensive operations in 1918. These formations were built around infiltration tactics. They did not advance in line. They moved in small groups, exploiting gaps in the enemy front, bypassing resistance, penetrating as far as possible before consolidating. The MP-18 was ideal for this role. It allowed a single soldier to suppress or eliminate multiple defenders without the burden of a machine gun. The weapon also appeared in defensive roles. German troops holding ruined villages, fortified farmhouses, or urban sectors used MP-18 to defend choke points and clear rooms. In static defense, the weapon's limited range was irrelevant. Engagements occurred at distances where a pistol cartridge was as lethal as a rifle round. A soldier defending a building entrance with an MP-18 could hold off multiple attackers, firing bursts through doorways and windows. The psychological effect was as important as the physical casualties inflicted. On 21st March 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael, the first of 5 major offensives collectively known as the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. The goal was to break through Allied lines before American reinforcements arrived in overwhelming numbers. Germany had one last chance to win the war. Failure meant collapse. The offensive began with a barrage unlike anything previously seen. Over 6,000 artillery pieces concentrated on a 50-mile front between Arras and La Fère opened fire at 0440 hours. High explosive, shrapnel and gas shells fell on British positions. The bombardment was not a prolonged pounding intended to destroy fortifications. It was a precisely timed hurricane designed to blind, deafen and disorient defenders. Gas shells targeted artillery positions, forcing British gun crews to don masks, slowing their response. High explosive and shrapnel hit command posts, communication trenches and forward positions. The barrage lasted 5 hours. By 0940 hours, when it lifted, the British Fifth Army's front was in chaos. The assault came through the fog. Dense mist covered the battlefield, reducing visibility to 20 meters or less. Stoßtruppen advanced in small groups, moving quickly through gaps in the Allied line, bypassing strong points, targeting headquarters, artillery positions and supply dumps. The MP-18 was in their hands. The fog was a deliberate advantage. German planners knew that mist was common in the Somme Valley in March. They timed the offensive to exploit it. In limited visibility, rifle marksmanship was useless. Machine guns could not engage targets they could not see. The advantage went to the attackers, who knew where they were going, who moved aggressively, who engaged at close range. The MP-18 was perfect for these conditions. British defenders, many of them dazed and gas-poisoned, found themselves facing automatic fire from unexpected directions. German assault troops did not stop to clear every trench. They pushed forward, leaving follow-on forces to mop up. The speed of penetration was unprecedented. Within hours, German forces had advanced several miles, overrunning positions that had been static for years. By nightfall on 21st March, the British Fifth Army had been pushed back 8 miles in some sectors. Communication lines were cut. Units were isolated, panic spread. The MP-18 excelled in this environment. Fog reduced visibility to the point where identifying targets beyond arm's length was impossible. What mattered was who could fire first and fire continuously. A stormtrooper entering a dugout or trench bay did not need to identify individual targets. He fired a burst into the confined space. The sound alone was disorienting. The impact was lethal. British after-action reports from the March offensive noted the presence of automatic pistols and machine pistols in German assault units. The 16th Division reported encounters with small automatic guns carried by infantry. The 21st Division noted German troops armed with automatic weapons fired from the hip. Intelligence officers examined captured examples with interest, noting the compact design, the drum magazine, the rate of fire. There was nothing equivalent in British service. The closest weapon was the Lewis gun, which weighed more than twice as much and fired a rifle cartridge. The speed of the German advance created logistical problems. Supply columns could not keep pace with assault troops. Ammunition expenditure was enormous. MP-18 gunners emptied their drums in minutes. Follow-on troops carried ammunition forward, but moving supplies through contested ground was dangerous and slow. By 24th March, the advance was slowing. German units were outrunning their supply lines. Allied reinforcements were arriving. The breakthrough that had seemed possible on 21st March was fading. Operation Michael continued until the 5th of April, when it was finally called off. Germany had captured over 1,200 square miles of territory, taken 90,000 prisoners, and inflicted 230,000 casualties. But strategic objectives had not been achieved. The British Fifth Army had not been destroyed. The breakthrough to Amiens had not occurred. German casualties exceeded 240,000, and the offensive had consumed irreplaceable ammunition and manpower reserves. But the tactical lesson was clear. The MP-18 had proven itself in the most demanding combat environment on the Western Front. Stormtroopers equipped with the weapon had achieved penetrations impossible with rifles and grenades alone. The weapon's ability to deliver automatic fire in confined spaces, in fog, in conditions where aimed rifle fire was impossible, had been demonstrated repeatedly. Operation Georgette followed on the 9th of April, a renewed offensive in the Lies sector. German assault troops attacked Portuguese and British positions, again achieving initial breakthroughs. The MP-18 was present in assault detachments, clearing fortified farms and villages. British defences, reinforced and alert after Operation Michael, responded more effectively. The offensive gained ground but failed to achieve a breakthrough. It was called off on the 29th of April. Operation Blücher York came on 27th May, an attack on French positions along the Chemin des Dames Ridge. This offensive achieved the deepest penetration of any German attack in 1918, advancing 40 kilometers in 3 days. Stormtroopers with MP-18 led the assault, clearing French trenches and bunkers. French troops, many of them war-weary veterans of Verdun and the Nivelle offensive, broke under the initial assault. German forces reached the Marne River by the 3rd of June, but again logistics caught up with the advance. Allied counterattacks, including American troops seeing their first major combat, halted the offensive by mid-June. Subsequent offensives in June and July saw continued use of the weapon. German assault troops used MP-18s to clear fortified villages, attack river crossings, and hold captured positions against counterattacks. The weapon was particularly effective in urban fighting. Ruined buildings and rubble-choked streets reduced engagement ranges to the point where pistol-caliber fire was as effective as rifle fire, and automatic capability was decisive. But by July, the strategic situation had shifted irreversibly. The German army had exhausted its offensive capability. Allied forces, reinforced by arriving American divisions, were preparing counterattacks. The initiative was passing. The MP-18 was not fired like a rifle. It was not aimed carefully at long range. It was a close-quarters weapon designed for rapid engagement at distances where missing was almost impossible. The doctrine surrounding its use reflected this reality. Stormtroopers carrying MP-18 were taught to fire short, controlled bursts. A typical burst was 3 to 5 rounds, enough to hit a target or suppress movement without wasting ammunition. The 32-round drum emptied in approximately 7 seconds of continuous fire. This was not enough for sustained suppression. It was enough for shock action. Reloading took time. A soldier under fire could not reload quickly. The drum had to be removed, a fresh one retrieved from a pouch inserted, and the action checked. This took 15 to 20 seconds under ideal conditions. Under fire, it took longer. Each soldier typically carried 2 to 4 spare drums, meaning total ammunition capacity was 96 to 160 rounds. Once these were exhausted, the MP-18 became a club. In a trench-clearing operation, the MP-18 gunner operated as part of a team. He moved behind a grenade thrower. The standard formation was simple: grenadier first, MP-18 gunner second, rifleman following. The grenadier would throw a stick grenade into a dugout entrance or around a trench corner. The steel-hand Granite 24, the standard German stick grenade, had a 5-second fuse. The grenadier would pull the cord, count 2 seconds, and throw. The grenade detonated in the air or on impact. The explosion disoriented defenders, filled the space with smoke and dust, drove survivors into cover. The MP-18 gunner immediately followed, moving into the space while defenders were still dazed, firing into the smoke. The combination was brutally effective. Defenders either died in the explosion or were caught in the open by automatic fire. There was no third option. The weapon's muzzle blast and noise added to its psychological effect. The sound of automatic fire in a confined space was physically painful. The pressure wave from multiple shots in rapid succession affected balance and hearing. The rapid mechanical hammering was unlike the sharp crack of rifle fire or the slower cadence of a heavy machine gun. It was distinct, recognizable, and terrifying. Soldiers who survived encounters with MP-18 armed assault troops later described the sound as the most frightening part of the experience. It signaled that resistance was futile, that return fire would be too slow, that death was seconds away. Ammunition expenditure was high even with fire discipline. A single drum lasted seconds in continuous fire, but even controlled bursts consumed ammunition rapidly. 3-round bursts, fired at 3-second intervals, emptied a drum in 40 seconds. In a prolonged engagement, this was unsustainable. Stormtroopers learned to pace their bursts, firing only when a target was visible or when suppression was necessary to allow movement. Even so, resupply became a problem in extended operations. Follow-on troops carried ammunition forward in satchels and pouches, but moving supplies through contested ground was dangerous and slow. MP-18 gunners often found themselves rationing rounds after the initial assault phase ended. Once drums were exhausted, the weapon was useless unless more ammunition could be brought forward. The weapon was less effective in open ground. Beyond 50 meters, accuracy dropped significantly. The short barrel and pistol cartridge limited effective range. The sights were adequate for close combat, but imprecise for aimed fire at distance. In no man's land or during advances across open terrain, the MP-18 was subordinate to rifles and machine guns. Its value was in trenches, buildings, and broken ground where the enemy was close and visibility was poor. Night fighting favored the MP-18. In darkness, aimed rifle fire was nearly impossible. Soldiers could not see iron sights. They could not judge range. They fired at muzzle flashes and sounds, hoping to hit something. The MP-18 allowed a soldier to sweep an area with automatic fire, hitting targets by volume rather than precision. German assault troops frequently conducted night raids using MP-18s to clear enemy positions with minimal risk of return fire. The psychological effect was magnified in darkness. Defenders hearing automatic fire in the dark, unable to see the source, often broke and fled. Germany's last offensive efforts collapsed by July 1918. Allied counteroffensives began in August, a period known as the 100 Days Offensive. The Second Battle of the Marne marked the turning point. American and French forces counterattacked on the 18th of July, pushing German troops back across the Marne River. German units that had advanced 40 kilometers in May were driven back to their start lines in 2 weeks. The initiative had shifted irreversibly. On August 8th, the British Fourth Army, reinforced by Canadian and Australian corps, attacked near Amiens. This offensive, known to Germans as the Schwarzer Tag, the Black Day of the German Army, shattered German defensive lines. Over 400 tanks supported the assault. German defenders, demoralized and outnumbered, surrendered in large numbers. Ludendorff later wrote that August 8th was the blackest day of the German army in the history of the war. The German army was no longer capable of sustained resistance. German forces were pushed back across the ground they had captured in the spring. The nature of fighting changed. Germany was now defending, often in improvised positions, against attacks by fresh British, French and American troops. Morale was collapsing. Discipline was eroding. Desertion rates climbed. Units at full strength in March were reduced to half strength by September. Replacements were untrained teenagers and older men previously considered unfit for combat. The German army was breaking. The MP-18 remained useful in this phase of the war, but its tactical role shifted. German rearguards used the weapon to hold villages, road junctions, and river crossings long enough for the main force to withdraw. In defensive fighting, the MP-18's range limitations mattered less. Engagements occurred at close quarters. Allied troops advancing through ruins or forest found themselves facing automatic fire from positions they thought were lightly held. American forces, entering combat in large numbers for the first time, encountered MP-18 armed German troops in the Meuse-Argonne and Saint-Mihiel sectors. The American Expeditionary Force launched the Meuse-Argonne Offensive on September 26th, the largest American operation of the war. Over 1 million American soldiers participated. German defenders, heavily outnumbered, used every available weapon to slow the advance. MP-18 equipped troops defended fortified villages and forest positions, firing from concealed positions, inflicting casualties disproportionate to their numbers. American after-action reports noted the weapon's effectiveness in defensive positions. The 77th Division, fighting in the Argonne forest, reported German machine pistols fired from close range, causing casualties during advances through dense undergrowth. The 82nd Division, attacking near Saint-Mihiel, noted automatic weapons smaller than machine guns used by German troops defending fortified farmhouses. American soldiers had no equivalent weapon. The Browning automatic rifle was just entering service, and it was a full-power automatic rifle weighing 7 kilograms, not a submachine gun. The closest equivalent was the Schoschal, a notoriously unreliable French light machine gun that American troops despised and discarded when possible. British forces also encountered the weapon in the final months. The BEF's advance through Flanders and Picardy met determined resistance at river lines and fortified villages. German troops holding these positions used MP-18 to defend choke points. A single soldier with an MP-18, positioned in a building overlooking a street or bridge, could hold up an entire platoon. The weapon's psychological effect remained potent. British soldiers, hearing the distinctive stutter, learned to take cover immediately. By October 1918, German forces were in full retreat. Discipline was collapsing, units were surrendering en masse, food and ammunition were scarce, railroads were breaking down. The German logistical system was in collapse, but the MP-18 remained in use wherever it could be supplied. German soldiers defending the final defensive lines before the armistice used the weapon to hold river crossings and fortified villages until they were bypassed or overrun. When the armistice came into effect on the 11th of November 1918, thousands of MP-18s were in German hands. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed on the 28th of June 1919, Germany was forbidden from producing or stockpiling automatic weapons, including submachine guns. Article 171 of the treaty specifically prohibited Germany from possessing machine guns, rifles, and carbines of all types. This was interpreted to include submachine guns. Existing examples were supposed to be destroyed or surrendered to Allied authorities. Many were not. The nickname trench broom appeared in English-language accounts of the weapon during and after the war. It was not a German term. German soldiers called it the Maschinenpistole, literally machine pistol, a straightforward functional description. Some referred to it as the Bergmann after the manufacturer. Others simply called it the MP. The English nickname reflected the weapon's function. It swept trenches clean. Whether this term was contemporary or a later invention is unclear. British intelligence reports from 1918 refer to machine pistols and automatic pistols, descriptive terms rather than nicknames. The phrase trench broom appears in post-war memoirs and historical accounts, suggesting it may have been coined retrospectively, perhaps by journalists or historians seeking a colourful term. Regardless of its origin, it captured the weapon's role perfectly. The MP-18 cleared trenches the way a broom swept floors, quickly, efficiently, and thoroughly. Allied soldiers who encountered the MP-18 in combat described it in terms that emphasized its psychological impact over its ballistic performance. The sound was the first shock. The weapon's report was neither the loud crack of a rifle nor the heavy thudding of a machine gun. It was a rapid, metallic stuttering, a mechanical hammering that echoed off trench walls and filled confined spaces with noise. The rate of fire was the second shock. Soldiers accustomed to bolt-action rifles, which fired as fast as a man could work the bolt, had never faced automatic fire from a shoulder weapon at close range. Machine guns delivered automatic fire, but they were fixed in place, served by crews, firing from known positions. The MP-18 was carried by a single soldier, fired from the hip or shoulder, appearing suddenly from fog or darkness. The realization that a single soldier could deliver automatic fire in a confined space was the third shock. For troops accustomed to bolt-action rifles and the slow, deliberate pace of trench warfare, the MP-18 represented something fundamentally different. It violated assumptions about infantry combat.